election, it's really important for us to understand how do elections work. I'd like to pay my respect to the Aboriginal elders, both past and present, and pay my respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people joining today and acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded as the traditional custodians of this land that we're talking about how to vote on. It's really important for us to recognise the history of this land within that context. And I will include some before we get into the election part. That's from Professor Gary Foley and Professor Alan Lester and Dr. Nikita Vanderbilt. But recognizing that when we're talking about this country, it's really important to recognize its history. And this map is from Daniel Boyd, who's a Kunja Ganja Kaku uh, Yalanja Jara Warinjabar Banjalang artist who really sets the tone of what history is with our artwork Treasure Island, showing colonization and Telenarius is piracy, because we really need to recognize that Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people have been here for thousands of years before, and this was the political landscape they functioned in. These are the nations of Australia. So this is what we've got to remember, that there were First Nations people of Australia, yet for 190 years of written Australian history, Aboriginal people have been exercised, excluded, and ignored. And the context that we need to recognize that this country was founded on is that between the 1770s and the 1830s, the British Empire's colonization shifted from the Americas to Asia, the Pacific, and then Africa. And this is like half a century of transition created what historians have called the Second British Empire. So this Second Empire was founded on free labor, freer trade, and the promotion of free settler colonialism. And within this shift from Americas to Asia and Pacific and later Africa, it was the result of the loss of the American colonies because of the American Revolution, primarily because of the resentment of the British Parliament's attempts to govern and tax American colonialists, and the acquisition of colonies seized from the French, Dutch, and Spanish during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, and the expansion of the East Indian Trading Company, which you might have heard of before, supported by the British Empire in India after the revolutions against the British Empire's backed Bengal. So that East Indian Trading Company came in there. So you can see here, this is what it looked like in 1770 to 1820s when Captain Cook um, came in, and how that actually started is in that 1770s. Captain Cook reported back to Britain that Australia looked like it would be a good place to set up a penal colony after the loss of the Americas. So then in 88, the 11 ships that encompassed the first fleet came to Sydney's Botany Bay here. So you can see by 1820 how much of the land had been colonized. Um, and this marks the beginning of the frontier wars of this country, the invasion and the colonization, and the fighting and resistance that would occur from First Nations people. So when we're talking about the frontier wars, we are really referring to all the massacres, the wars, and the incidents of resistance since the beginning of the arrival of the colonists in this country. So the wars are said to end in 1934. But yeah, we kind of raise how the Australian government has continued to use violence and oppression against First Nations communities that have continued today in different forms. But so does First Nations resilience, as we've seen, ever increasing participations in Invasion Day and Day of Mourning events across this land. But yeah, in the mid 1880s, the movement for federation started, and a federation is when a group of organizations, countries, or regions join together to form a larger government or organization. So up until the 1850s, each colony was run by a non-elected governor appointed by the British Parliament. But then there was a Eureka Stockade, where there was rebellion by gold miners in Ballarat that you might remember from primary school doing in 1854, which was a response to the government's management of the goldfields. So this like battle, the Eureka Stockade, is considered to be the beginning of Australian democracy, and the idea gained momentum after Canada's unification in 1967. So in the late 1890s, conventions were held and a constitution was drafted. And then the British Parliament passed the constitution in the 1900s, approved through referenda negotiations with Britain. You got to get that first before Australia became a federation in 1901. And so that's where many features of like Australians system of government come from, being based on like the Westminster system with a representative democracy and a constitutional monarchy. So we have a representative democracy and where citizens choose people to represent them in parliament. And we have a constitutional monarchy, which is a king or queen as the head of state, but has limited power. So they must follow the country's constitution and follow accepted practices known as conventions. So, our Commonwealth Franchise Act in 1902 gave men and women around Australia the right to vote, but it actually excluded Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people unless they already had the right to vote before 1901. So, this meant that while Aboriginal men could vote in Victoria, New South Wales, and South Australia because they had the right to vote before 1901, it took until much later, 1984, until Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were politically equivalent with other Australians under the Commonwealth Electoral Amendment Act. So, we need to really recognise the foundations of this country's voting and the history around it, which is, quite inherently racist. So, since 1901, there has been three levels of government within Australia. So, you have federal parliament, state and territory, and also local councils there. You can see within this next slide the breakdown of what people are like different parts of government are responsible for. So, we've got the federal parliament, and there's 151 people who are nominated by in federal electorates called members of parliament. And they deal with things like about defence and income tax, immigration, social welfare, and external affairs. And then there is state and territory matters there. So you can see what the things that they're responsible: schools, hospitals, public transport. Within that, and then there are local matters. So more than roads, rates, and rubbish, that's for sure. You can see that there's a lot of things that local government are responsible for, and they have elected members and then the staff within there. But local government's actually not mentioned in the Constitution. It's only state and federal. And there are some things like called concurrent powers, which is in the Constitution, which means that there's some things that both the state and federal are responsible for. Yeah, that's probably most relevant within COVID. We saw when they fought over the certain things and who was responsible for which there. So that's why, because there's concurrent powers. But we'll just focus on federal election with that upcoming and what does that look like and how does federal parliament work. So, federal parliament's divided up into two parts or two structures. So, you have the House of Representatives, which is also known as the People's House, and each member represents the people of their electorate. And Australia is divided into electorates based on population. So, voters in each electorate choose one person to represent them in the House of Representatives, and then you also have the Senate, also like sometimes called the upper house, and voters from each state, the ACT and the Northern Territory, elect senators to represent them in the Senate. All states are equally represented in the Senate, regardless of their size or population, but not the ACT or the Northern Territory. So each state elects 12 senators, but the ACT and the NT only elect 2 senators each. So state senators are elected for a 6-year fixed term, with half of their senators elected every 3 years. But territory senators are elected for the term of the House of Representatives, which is 3 years. So that's why every 3 years we have a House of Representatives election, and we have half of the senators up for election every federal election time. And that's really mainly so that you keep some consistency within the Senate. So you've got a proportion of people that are experienced and able to hold the government account. And we'll go into that a bit more about the Senate's responsibilities. But focusing on the House of Representatives, you can see here that Australia is divided up into 151 electorates, each representative by one member. And under the Constitution, each state is guaranteed at least 5 members, but all states except Tasmania now have more. And that's based on population. There's a lot more population in the states and territories, so that they have more electorates to make it more even in the distribution. And so in the last election, there are 117,000 enrolled people per electorate. That's just shifted for this federal election, not by much, but we've just had like a redistribution of electorates, and that's just to make sure that all electorates have the same amount of population. So there was like a shift in Sydney, in Grainler, and the city of Sydney, their boundaries shifted a little bit because of like population density, as well as like in West Melbourne as the other example that comes to mind. So those boundaries or those lines of those electorates shift based on population changes there. And yeah, that really impacts the makeup of the House of Representatives. And you can see here. And how it looks is you can see all of the Labor, the red there, and the green and the blue, which is the Liberal National Party. And then you've got your independents and Greens there. Now, the difference between the two here, you can see that it looks like it's quite a high Liberal vote, but that's because those are areas that are quite geographically not dense of population, like they've got low population density. So they're bigger geographical areas. So like the more you go into a city, the closer people are together, so that the smaller geographically the different electorates are. So that's why it looks like on this map that there are lots of Liberal national parties. So you can see here the Green, and here the Liberal, and then the Labor. You've got independents in orange there. But when you look at here, there's a lot more Labor, and that's because they have more of the city or metropolitan vote electorates. And then the Liberal National Party and Greens. And then over here, you can see the Senate. So there's not as many seats within the Senate, but you can see that it's a different makeup, because over here, you're voting in the House of Representatives for your local representative. But in the Senate, it's more of a vote for who are the people that align the values of your state. And like they're going to be the people that are going to be there for 6 years. So like who are the people that demonstrate the values and the policies of the state. So there's a different makeup within the Senate there. And when you're looking at a television, you can see that there's a House of Representatives there, which is green, and then the Senate is red over there too. And the difference between the two of them there is that the House of Representatives is responsible for forming government. So looking back at here is that you need a majority of representatives, of local representatives, to form government in the House of Representatives. So you can see that both the House and the Senate are responsible for proposing, debating, and voting on bills and amendments, both decide matters. They're all scrutinizing, but it's just different in terms of like what committees that they decide on, and like their daily functioning and because the Senate is responsible for like scrutinizing the bills that come through from the House of Representatives. So all of the legislation must pass from the House of Representatives to the Senate, and because the Senate is every 6 years, they represent a much more like stable view of the what people's values and policies are. So they can change things or amend things. They can examine issues in committees. They really have a scrutinizing role of the government of the day. Looking at this graph, and we've just touched on before, that the House of Representatives is the one that forms government. So what that means is you need a majority in the House of Representatives to form government. So, and that's like having a majority of the members, and you can see that here that for the Albanese, Scott Morrison, Malcolm Turnbull, and Scott Morrison, and then the Tony Abbott and the Malcolm Turnbull, we've all had majority governments, which means they've all had a majority within the House of Representatives, which you can see here. The last time we had a minority government was in 2010 when Labor formed a minority government with 3 independents and 1 Green. So, to dive in that a bit more, what happened is that there was a hung parliament, which meant that there was no political party that had enough seats to secure an overall majority of members in the House of Representatives. So, over here, they didn't have a majority of seats, so it was a hung parliament. So, what that means is that they had to go through a period of time to form a minority government. So to govern with the majority of all members. So you can see here what they did in 2010. And so the federal election resulted in a hung parliament. So no party or coalition of parties, so the LNP or the Liberal National Coalition, had more than half of the members in the House of Representatives. So to form a government or a party or coalition of parties needs 76 seats or more. So the Australian Labor Party won 72 seats in 2010, and the Liberal National Party won 73 seats, but there were 5 seats that were won by minor party or independents. So for 17 days, both the major parties attempted to gain the support of 5 minor parties or independents, but after negotiations, the support of 4 members of these were gained by the Labor Party, so that they formed the first minority government that Australia has had since 1940, which is a while ago. So a parliamentary minority is when a government formed by a party or coalition party does not have a majority within the House of Representatives, but it governs with the support of all members. So that's the support that was gained by those within there. So why that's important this time is the coalition, so the Liberal National Party having 73 seats, so it's not enough to be a majority at 76. Labor 65, the Independents 8, Greens 1, Katter Party 1, and the Centre Alliance 1. These are also just on the latest poll, 5,000 people by YouGov, so it's like still quite contested, and it's just modelling based off 5,000 people's what they've said they would vote this election. So, what this might mean is that we're going to have a minority government where no one party or coalition are able to have a majority within the House of Representatives here. So, what this is why preferential voting and understanding preferential voting is so important to understand the power of your vote and what it does. So, when you go to vote, this is what it looks like in the House of Representatives, the green ticket, and then you have the Senate. So within the House of Representatives, you have to number all of the boxes from 1 to 8 in the order of your choices because there's 8 candidates here, but you have to, all of them in the House of Representatives. And then in the Senate, above the line is 6. You have to do 6, or if you do below the line, you do 12. Now, if you would vote below the line if there was somebody in like an ungrouped ticket there. You can see on the end they're ungrouped, so they're not part of a party, and you want them to be a senator. So you would like start, wherever, and you would put them in. But if you are happy for parties to get in, then you would vote above the line, and then the parties would then, their senators would get in based off that. But you still have to vote up to 6 of them. But what preferential voting is where candidates must receive an absolute majority, which is more than 50% of the formal votes cast to be elected. And formal votes cast is like people follow the instructions, so they number all of the boxes and they number them clearly. You know, they don't draw anything on the paper that impedes the being able to see the numbers. So they means to receive more than 50% of the total formal votes cast. And if an absolute majority is not gained on the first vote, then the preferences are distributed until an absolute majority is obtained. So what that means is this is a great example from the AEC. So looking at this picture here, you can see that none of these four candidates have an absolute majority. They don't have 50% of the vote or more than. So you can see Tom 32, Rachel 28, 25 for Omar, and 15 for Lily. So the person with the lowest amount of votes in preferential voting system it was the first one to be excluded. And what happens is Lily's votes are then distributed to the second preferences on those ballots. So what happens is that the Australian Electoral Commission, they will get all of Lily's, 15,000 votes, every single one of Lily's 15,000 votes. So people have written one for Lily on that ballot. They will then look at who people have put two on that ballot, and that vote will go to them. Picture that is literally the AEC. You can see here that everybody has voted one for Lily on their ticket. So one Lily. But on the first one, the second preference of the person is Rachel. So that ballot will be put in Rachel's pile, and that will count as a vote for Rachel. And then in the second one, in the middle, you can see that they voted for Lily one, but their two is Omar. So this vote will move from the Lily pile into the Omar pile because this person voted for Omar second. And then in the third one, you can see here that they voted for Lily first, but then, oh, this doesn't make sense because they didn't put the preferences right. So would be an informal ballot, and unfortunately, this wouldn't count because they didn't label the boxes properly. But that's why it's really important to number the boxes properly so people know where your preferences are going to flow to. And you can see here, so Lily's has been excluded, which means that they are no longer able to be in the House of Representatives. So Omar has gained an extra 8,000 second preferences. So 8,000 people put Omar as number two on their ballot or their vote paper. So they're up to 33,000. Tom was number two on 2,000 people's vote paper. So Tom has now gone up to 3,400, and Rachel was number two on 5,000 people's vote papers, or ballot papers. So Rachel has gone up to 33,000 votes then. So then you can see it gets a little bit tricky because both Omar and Rachel are on 33,000. So what happens then is if there's a situation where they're exactly the same, then the candidate with the lowest amount of votes in the first count was excluded. So Omar in the first count, going back here, Omar had 25,000 votes in the first count, but Rachel had 28. So because Omar had the lowest in the first count, their one is excluded. So that's only when they're exact, which would be, it's really difficult to happen, but then Omar is knocked out. So within the third count, when Omar is excluded, their votes are then distributed to the next person on the paper. So what that looks like is that in the first example here, you can see that this person voted for Lily first, but Lily's vote's excluded, so their vote moved to Omar. But this time, Omar's vote is excluded because they don't have enough to form absolute majority, so their vote then moves into Tom's pile. So their vote is currently counting for Tom. You can see in this one, they voted for Omar first, but Omar doesn't have enough to form absolute majority, so they moved to Lily. Lily doesn't have enough to form absolute majority, so their vote is going to their number 3, which is Rachel. So that's how the preferences are flowing, and your vote always counts. It will just keep flowing until somebody it forms an absolute majority. So Rachel wasn't the candidate that had the most votes in the first count, but they gained absolute majority on preferences. So they are the most preferred of all of the candidates by the absolute end there. And you can see that they won with 51,000 votes. So in this election, voters' first, second, and third choices were needed for the final result. So you keep looking at people's preferences until you find the absolute majority for that lower house seat, for that one person in your local area. That's how they figure out who is going to be your representative. Um, so you pick where your preference goes, not the candidates, not anybody else. You pick where it flows down the path. And on election day, there might be volunteers then from a political party that are handing out how to vote cards, but these cards are just suggestions on how to vote. You do not have to vote in line with a how to vote. Political parties will do a how to vote probably because they have done the research and they say, oh, well, this party most aligns with me. So if I don't get in, then your preference will go to somebody that I think is the next best choice. So they're just providing a suggestion for you to follow, but you definitely don't have to follow a how to vote. You can number your ballot, your piece of paper, however you want. You don't have to follow how a political party puts it on a how to vote. You just need to follow the instructions on the how to vote on how many things to number on there. Um, and there are some myths that you might hear about like the wasted vote and where does that come from. And I think that's where people not understanding that we're not a first past the post system. So before 1918, representatives to federal parliament were elected on like a simple majority or a first past the post basis, which means that the candidate who has the most votes after one count was elected, even if they didn't have more than half of the votes. So like you can see here that Tim would be the representative in the first past the post electoral system. And this is the system that's used in the US, the UK, Canada, India, and Papua New Guinea. But it is not the election system that we use here, or the voting system. We use preferential voting. So that's where the misunderstanding probably comes from around like a wasted vote. Because if you were voting for Lily and Lily was like a minor party, then Lily, your vote doesn't transfer to Omar or Rachel or Tom. If it's first past the post, it's just Lily and done. But in preferential voting, Lily's votes will go to whoever's number 2 on the ticket. So your vote always counts for that full one for the House of Representatives. Another thing that you might hear is, but like party X gives their preferences to Y party. And I think that might come from the Senate group voting ticketing. That system that existed prior to 2016. So what that meant is that you could vote above the line by just putting a single one vote in a box for a party, and then the party would decide where the preferences went according to their like pre-lodge ticket. Or you could vote below the line, which by numbering every single box, which could be like 100 candidates, which is like so hard to get all of those numberings completely right. So like think about this here on the Senate. You would have to like number all those boxes completely right, or you just put one above the line and then the party goes, oh, well, this can go here or that can go there based on what they want their preferences to go. So that was an old system called Senate group voting ticketing. Ticket voting, and that's not around anymore. So that was prior to 2016. But after the 2013 election, Ricky Moore from the Australian Motoring Enthusiast Party won a Senate seat with just 0.51% of first preference votes through a series of like complex preference deals. They still won a Senate seat. So yeah, they got rid of the that because they, yeah, Lily, Omar, and Rachel shouldn't decide where their votes go. You should decide where your votes go and the preferences go. So that system changed in 2016. And here are a bunch of resources that you can send to people. The Juice Media one is quite satirical, and there's two AEC ones. One's like a 2-pager if people like reading, and the other one's like a 1 minute and 46-second video on preferential voting. That's quite good. And it's really important that people understand how preference voting works this federal election, because this federal election really matters. Like we just touched on before, it could be a minority government, and this minority government is like making legislation or laws around climate change, which just keep getting worse. We're in a cost of living crisis where our income, like less than 50% of taxpayers in Australia earn less than $50,000. And this is like from 2021. So I'm really interested to see the latest research on this. But you can see that our cost of living, fuel's gone up 36%. This is 2013 as well. This is not even the latest data. This hasn't even come out yet. Gas, household fuels, electricity, 20%. Like we're in a cost of living crisis. And people think that big business have too much power. So this next upcoming government really needs to like think about what is going to happen here, because really, and like this is in 2018, the last one that this was done, 76% of people then thought that big business had too much power. Um, and it's going to be really interesting, and your preferences matter so much, is because the amount of people that say that they're a lifetime Labor voter or a lifetime Liberal voter is like at an all-time low. You can see here that in 2022, only 12% of people said that they were like a stable, rusted-on Labor voter, like they weren't changing their vote, and 16% of people are a stable Liberal National. This is a really interesting study by the Australian National University. They do an electoral study every election period. So what this looks like this federal election is going to be really interesting. So more and more people aren't voting for a major party. You can see that here with their swings away from them. They're just going down. But people are voting for a conservative minor party, and that's kind of conservative, concerning for a progressive organization like Tomorrow Movement that's fighting for good jobs, great public services, and a safe climate for all. Like we need to be really careful about who we're voting for, and understanding that our preferences are important, because we're continually seeing the rise of the far right and conservative politics and mainstream media. And we need to be like looking at how we can address that. So yeah, let's talk about how if the people in power are polluting the river, we need to actively be campaigning within our communities. We can't just be like, feed a person a fish, feed them a day, teach a person a fish, feed them a lifetime. That's great. Like, let's educate people, like, let's teach them. But we also need to actively be campaigning with the people around us this federal election to make sure that they understand their power, because there is a mass power shift this federal election where Gen Z and millennials are making up over 47% of the population. And so it's, we've finally come to that time and we are the majority. So how can we build power through the people around us to make the change this federal election for what we want in the future? How can we tell powerful narrative about young people this federal election to make them feel powerful, to prove to all political candidates that our generation is a generation that is a force to be reckoned with, and that they need to try and to appeal to our vote. Like we just saw before, more than 76% of people do think that big business has too much power. So how can we shift it this election to make people, those representatives, think about young people and just not big business more, think about the people that they're representing. So really, that is the goal of this federal election for Tomorrow Movement, is like, how can we get people to be really involved in all of these ladders of engagement in campaigning in their community? So how can they come on board with observing our campaign, following, endorsing it, contributing it to owning a part of this federal election campaign? And that's something that we really challenge you to take on board, is like with this knowledge of understanding how the federal government works, and that this election will be different and matters for all of those reasons, how can you support people to campaign as part of this federal election?